Around the world, thousands of people have been locked away for crimes they never committed. Their lives stolen by rushed investigations, unreliable witnesses, and broken justice systems. Some spent years, others decades, fighting to prove their innocence. These are not just stories of crime. They are stories of human tragedy, resilience, and the pursuit of truth. Today, we bring together some of the most shocking wrongful convictions from history, where justice failed and lives were changed forever. Stephen Avery's story is one of the most controversial cases in American true crime history. In 1985, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman in Wisconsin, despite weak evidence. He maintained his innocence for years, but it wasn't until 2003, after 18 long years in prison, that DNA testing proved he was not the attacker. His release was a moment of hope, and Avery even filed a lawsuit against the county for his wrongful conviction. But before that case was even settled, his life took another dark turn. In 2005, Avery was arrested again, this time accused of murdering Teresa Halbach, a young photographer. Prosecutors claimed overwhelming evidence linked him to the crime, while Avery's defense argued he was framed. The case sparked global attention after the Netflix series Making a Murderer, raising questions about corruption, police misconduct, and whether Avery is truly guilty. His story forces us to confront the painful truth that not everyone accused is always guilty, and not every accused is a Dr. Harold Shipman. In 1989, a young woman was brutally attacked while jogging in Central Park, New York. She was beaten so badly that she fell into a coma, but after months of recovery, she survived, though with permanent memory loss of the attack. Police quickly arrested 5 teenagers between the ages of 14 and 16. After hours of pressure and questioning, without lawyers or parents, the boys gave false confessions that didn't match each other or the evidence. Despite the lack of proof, the public wanted justice, and the teens were convicted. Most of them spent around 6 to 7 years in prison, while the oldest served more than 11 years in an adult prison. Their youth was stolen behind bars. In 2002, the real attacker, Matias Reyes, confessed, and DNA testing proved he was guilty. The 5 were finally declared innocent after more than a decade of being labeled criminals. In 2014, New York City awarded them $41 million for the injustice. Rubin Carter was a rising boxing star in the 1960s, known for his powerful punches and dreams of becoming a world champion. In the ring, his speed and force were so overwhelming that people began calling him Hurricane Carter because he fought like a storm. But in 1966, his career and freedom were suddenly taken away. He was arrested in New Jersey and accused of killing 3 people in a bar shooting. The case against him was weak. The only evidence came from 2 criminals who later admitted they lied to reduce their own punishment. Still, Carter and his friend were convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Carter never gave up his fight for justice. He wrote a book from his prison cell and gained support from celebrities, activists, and even Bob Dylan, who wrote a famous song about his case. For nearly 20 years, he insisted he was innocent. Finally, in 1985, a federal judge overturned his conviction, saying it was based on racial prejudice and lies. Carter was freed at age 48, but he had already lost the best years of his life. His story remains one of the strongest examples of how wrongful convictions can destroy a person's dreams and future. In 1974, 2 pubs in Birmingham, England, were bombed, killing 21 people and injuring many more. The attack shocked the country, and police were desperate to find those responsible. Within days, 6 Irishmen, later known as the Birmingham Six, were arrested while traveling from Ireland to England. The men were beaten during interrogations and forced to sign confessions they said were lies. There was no reliable evidence linking them to the bombs, but in 1975, they were convicted and each sentenced to life in prison. For years, their families fought to prove their innocence. Over time, evidence came out showing that police had falsified statements and hidden key facts. Witnesses admitted their testimonies were unreliable. Still, it took until 1991, 16 years later, for the men to finally be released after their convictions were declared unsafe. The Birmingham Six lost some of the best years of their lives, not because of guilt, but because of a rush for justice. Their story remains one of Britain's most infamous wrongful convictions. Tyna Pora was just 17 years old in Auckland when his life changed forever. In 1992, a woman named Susan Burdett was brutally raped and murdered in her own home. Police were under pressure to solve the case quickly. Tyna, a teenager with learning difficulties and a troubled past, became their easy target. After hours of questioning, he gave a false confession, hoping to claim a reward and not fully understanding the seriousness of his words. Despite the fact that there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, Tyner was convicted in 1994 and sentenced to life in prison. Years later, DNA evidence proved the crime was actually committed by serial rapist Malcolm Reva, who had attacked many women in Auckland. Still, it took more than 20 years before Tyner's conviction was overturned in 2015. He was finally freed and later awarded $3.5 million in compensation for the years stolen from him. In 1975, in the quiet town of Rochdale, England, the body of 11-year-old Leslie Molseed was found on a moor. Police were desperate to solve the case, and soon their suspicion fell on Stefan Kisko, a 23-year-old tax clerk with learning difficulties who lived with his mother. Stefan had no history of violence, but after hours of exhausting interrogation, he gave a confused statement the police treated as a confession. Even though there was no solid evidence against him, he was convicted in 1976 and sentenced to life in prison. He spent 16 years behind bars, wrongly branded as a child killer. Then, in 1992, DNA testing proved what he had said all along. He was not the man responsible. Stefan was finally cleared and released, but freedom came at a heavy cost. His health had collapsed, and just 1 year later, at 41 years old, he passed away. The Kisko case stands as one of Britain's most heartbreaking examples of a wrongful conviction. In the late 1940s, Mahmoud Muttan, a sailor, moved to Cardiff, Wales, in search of a better life. By the 1950s, he was married with children and working hard to provide for his family. But in 1952, his world was torn apart when he was accused of murdering Lily Volpert, a shopkeeper who had been brutally killed in her store. The evidence against Muttan was weak, built largely on shaky witness statements. Still, at a time when racism was rife in Britain, he was portrayed as a dangerous outsider. His own lawyer even called him a half-child of nature during trial, words that did more harm than help. Despite insisting he had nothing to do with the crime, Mahmoud was found guilty. In September 1952, he was executed by hanging at Cardiff Prison, becoming the last man in Wales to face the death penalty. Nearly half a century later, in 1998, the Court of Appeal reviewed his case. They found serious flaws. Key evidence had been withheld, and the witnesses were unreliable. The court overturned his conviction, declaring Mahmoud Muttan innocent. But justice had arrived, tragically too late. In the summer of 1953, 3 American hunters went missing in the forests of Quebec, Canada. Weeks later, their bodies were found, and pressure mounted on authorities to solve the crime quickly. Attention soon turned to Wilbert Coffin, a 43-year-old local prospector who lived off the land. Coffin had helped the hunters when their car broke down, but instead of being seen as a good neighbor, he became the prime suspect. The evidence was thin, mostly circumstantial, such as him being in the area, and later found with some items that could have belonged to the man. Still, with international pressure from the United States demanding justice, prosecutors pushed forward. In 1954, Wilbert Coffin was convicted of murdering one of the hunters and sentenced to death. He always denied killing anyone, explaining that he had simply scavenged items after finding them abandoned. Despite appeals and public campaigns claiming he was innocent, Coffin was executed by hanging in 1956. To this day, many legal experts, journalists, and human rights advocates believe his trial was deeply flawed and politically influenced, a lasting symbol of wrongful conviction. In 1949, Timothy Evans, his wife Beryl, and their baby lived at 10 Rillington Place in London. Sharing the same house was their downstairs neighbor, John Christie. Life was difficult for the young couple, especially with money trouble, and tragedy struck when Beryl was found dead. Evans went to the police in Wales and gave a confused story. First, he said Beryl had died after an abortion. Then he claimed Christie was involved. Later, under pressure, he signed another statement saying he himself had done it. These contradictory confessions immediately placed him under suspicion. When police searched the house, they found the bodies of Beryl and the baby hidden inside. With Evans' words pointing in different directions, officers chose the simplest path. They blamed him and ignored Christie. Evans was convicted and executed in 1950. But just 3 years later, Christie was unmasked as a serial killer. Only then did the truth connect back. Evans had likely been innocent all along. In 2004, Sam Hallam, a 17-year-old from London, was walking home when a man was fatally stabbed nearby. Police quickly focused on Sam and his friends because they had been seen in the area earlier, even though there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Under questioning, Sam's statements were misunderstood and misrepresented in court. Despite insisting he was innocent, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He spent 7 years behind bars, fighting to prove he didn't commit the crime. In 2012, after new evidence emerged, including witness recantations and flaws in the original investigation, Sam's conviction was quashed. He walked free at age 25, finally cleared of all charges. Sam Hallam's case highlights how circumstantial evidence and miscommunication can destroy a young life, making it one of Britain's most shocking wrongful convictions. In 1921, in Melbourne, Australia, a young girl named Alma Turch was discovered murdered. The shocking crime shook the city, and police quickly looked for a suspect. Attention fell on Colin Campbell Ross, a 41-year-old wine bar owner, partly because he had been seen near the area and had a questionable alibi. Under pressure, Ross gave statements to police that were later used against him in court. Despite no direct evidence linking him to the murder, he was convicted and sentenced to death. His protests of innocence were ignored, and in 1922, he was executed by hanging. Decades later, in 2008, modern DNA testing on preserved evidence showed that Ross could not have been the killer. His conviction was posthumously quashed, confirming that he had been wrongfully executed. Today, Ross's case stands as one of Australia's most notorious wrongful convictions, highlighting the dangers of rushed investigations and circumstantial evidence. In 1976 and 1977, two young women, Sigrid Heggheim and Torunn Finstad, were murdered in Trondheim, Norway. With the city under pressure, police turned their focus on Fritz Mohn, a 35-year-old man who was deaf, partially paralyzed on one side, and lived nearby. He was socially isolated, had difficulty explaining his whereabouts, and quickly became a convenient suspect. During interrogations, Mohn struggled to understand what was being asked. Police used leading questions, and eventually he signed statements he didn't fully comprehend. Investigators treated those as confessions, despite them being inconsistent and even physically impossible given his disabilities. Mohn was convicted of Heggheim's murder in 1978 and Finstad's in 1981, receiving a long prison sentence. He spent nearly 18 years behind bars insisting he wasn't the killer. Years later, DNA evidence and a deathbed confession from another man cleared Mohn completely. Sadly, he died in 2005, just before Norway's courts officially declared him innocent. David Milgaard was just 16 years old in 1969, a free-spirited teenager traveling across Canada with his friends. On the same morning in Saskatoon, a nurse named Gail Miller was brutally murdered. With little evidence and mounting pressure to solve the case, police began looking for someone who fit the image of a drifter. David, young, long-haired, and passing through town that day, quickly became their focus. Witness statements from his own friends, made under pressure, painted him in a suspicious light, even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Despite pleading that he had nothing to do with it, David was convicted in 1970 and handed a life sentence. He spent 23 years behind bars, watching his youth slip away behind prison walls. It wasn't until the 1990s, when DNA testing became reliable, that the truth emerged. The evidence proved David Milgaard was not the killer. Another man, Larry Fisher, was responsible. David was freed at 39 years old, after losing more than half his life to a wrongful conviction. In 1994, Perth jeweler Pamela Lawrence was brutally killed inside her store. Police quickly looked for suspects and focused on Andrew Mallard, a young man living on the streets after a nervous breakdown. He had been nearby and had impersonated a police officer during a small burglary, which made him seem suspicious. During questioning, Mallard struggled, but when he repeated ideas that investigators suggested about how the crime might have happened, police treated it as a confession. There was no weapon, no forensic evidence. Yet in 1995, he was convicted of murder. Mallard spent the next 12 years in prison, fighting to clear his name. A journalist and a lawyer uncovered hidden reports showing the supposed weapon could not have caused the injuries. In 2006, after the High Court quashed his conviction, Mallard finally walked free. Later, a cold case review identified the real killer, Simon Rockford. Mallard was compensated with millions, but his story remains a stark warning of how rushed justice can destroy innocent lives.